In the halls of video games, there are those games that are considered the greatest of all time. You know the ones, Super Mario Brothers and so on. Well, today, boys and girls, we're going to count down the 100 greatest games of all time. Now, before we begin, I'm going to say that I'm pulling these entries from the book 100 Greatest Video Games by Ian Lee. So, in part 1, we're going to count down the first 50. So when you ask any Pokemon fan what are some of the best Pokemon games of all time, Gold and Silver always come up. So before Gold and Silver, there were the original 151 Pokemon catch. But when Pokemon Gold and Silver came out, that number was bumped up to 251, since the game added 100 new Pokemon. Not only that, but it also gave the worldwide Pokemon fans a whole new region and lore to explore with the introduction of Johto League, along with something that was never before seen in any RPG at the time, and that was an entire day and night cycle. This made the game more immersive. Now, like Marvel, who created the whole post-credit scene, Pokemon and Gold gave the world the post-game scene. So after you play beating the main story of the game, you can travel back to Kanto and begin again. Gold and Silver also introduced 2 new Pokemon types, Dark and Steel, along with an entire breeding system to allow players to breed their Pokemon. So, if you really wanted an entire team of Pikachu-based Pokemon, you can breed it. The year is 1981, and up to this point, games like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and Asteroids have been everyone's go-to arcade game to play, but a newcomer decided to show them all up, and that's Defender, created by Eugene Jarvis and Williams Electronics. So what makes this game so good? Well, before all arcade games were just a single screen you had to look at. Defender changed all that when it introduced the world to an arcade game that had a horizontal scrolling environment, which was not heard of in 1981. Next was the inclusion of an in-game radar, which allowed players to keep an eye on friends or foes. This element also made a whole new level of skill in a game where players had to learn to multitask during gameplay. And let's not forget the difficulty level. Defender was not just difficult, it was brutally difficult. You had waves of enemies you had to take on, all the while trying to save civilians from becoming mutants at the same time. Civilization 4, released in 2005 for various systems, Sid Meier's Civilization series was groundbreaking, but it was the 4th game in the series that truly made the series great. It was the perfect blend of depth for veterans of the series and accessibility for those who were fresh to the series. Not only did they add that, but Civ 4 also added the concept of religion into the game, adding a whole new layer of strategy that players had to deal with, along with the Great People system, which allowed you to choose which direction you want your civilization to go towards, depending on the great person you choose. If you wanted to go to science and technology, you would choose a great scientist, and so on. Along with going from a static government system to a civic system, which allowed players to tailor the game to their playstyle. The year is 2004, and Hideo Kojima and his team outdid themselves for the 3rd in the Metal Gear Solid series, titled Snake Eater. Let's talk about the setting of the game. Unlike the first 2, where you had to sneak your way into high-tech labs or industrial complexes, in Snake Eater you are thrown straight into the jungles of Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War in 1964. This is not just a simple backdrop, though. It was part of the mechanics of the game, which meant you not only used it to help you out in gameplay, it also would work against you at times. Next is the Camo Index, which allowed you to pick how you wanted to camouflage yourself to fit into your surroundings. Those are some of what makes Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater one of the 100 greatest games. Released in 1993 for the Game Boy, Link's Awakening was not only the first Legend of Zelda game for the Game Boy, but it was often considered and overlooked. To me, it is a true Game Boy classic. So much it showed us what the Game Boy can do when it's pushed to its limits. Final Fantasy IX is a game that pleased all of us Final Fantasy fans with it. To me, this was a way for Squaresoft to say sorry for Final Fantasy Tactics, a Final Fantasy game that I actually hate. The music of Final Fantasy IX, plus the gameplay and the story are just amazing. Advanced Wars, which was released in 2001 for the Game Boy Advance. Advanced Wars was the essential turn-based game for anyone who had a Game Boy Advance. Before that, most of the world thought turn-based combat was only for the Japanese. That all changed when Advanced Wars was released. Released in 1986 for the Master System. Now, when you think Sega mascots, the first thought in your mind is Sonic, right? Well, before Sonic, there was Alex Kidd. Even though he is not the official Sega mascot, he is still considered a true classic in its own right. It's no wonder why Alex Kidd and Miracle World won more awards than Super Mario Bros. Released in 2001 for the PS2, ICO is a haunting and amazing stylish puzzle platformer for the PS2 with a wonderfully touching fantasy experience to date. It's one of the inspirations for such modern classics like Dark Souls. Released in 2004 for the PC, World of Warcraft is one of the most influential MMORPGs of all time. Well, in my mind at least. Here's some facts as to why the game is one of the greatest. WoW is the fourth in the Warcraft series. At its peak, it is one of the highest grossing games of all time. Well over 10 billion copies sold by July 2012. Blizzard, who also created the hugely successful Diablo series, still makes a ton of cash on World of Warcraft. Released in 1991 for the Mega Drive. So, if you had the Mega Drive and wanted to play Final Fight, you were just out of luck. That wasn't until Streets of Rage came out. This game was just as good as Final Fight, but in my opinion, it's better than Final Fight. Released in 1996 for the PC. Now, if you ask me what my college years were all about, I would say, well, some partying and got wasted, and others studied in the spare time. I, however, spent most of my spare time lashed onto the college's network with a few dorm mates trying to outlast each other in a LAN game, which, those of you who don't know what LAN is, it stands for Local Area Network, game of Quake. Quake was the first first-person shooter game in total 3D graphics. It set the bar for all of those to come after it. The original Legend of Zelda, which was released in 1986 for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Legend of Zelda is one of the best of the NES in my mind. It's not only a true classic in the RPG genre, but it also spawned a ton of sequels. Now, it's no wonder that one game franchise has evolved and kept evolving over the years, and that is Grand Theft Auto. But it wasn't until GTA San Andreas came out in 2004 for the PS2. being the last of the GTA games that generation. It took the concept of customizing your character to a whole new level. Why just create a character when you can create a character and throughout the game you can evolve it even more. You can work on CJ's fitness and appearance, and more and more. Who can't forget memorable lines like, "All you had to do was follow a damn train, CJ." Released in 2001 for the Dreamcast. We all know that as a console, the Dreamcast didn't last long, but it did a few notable games for it, and RES is one of them, and it's wireframe game design. Released in 2002 for the GameCube. Now this game was one of my favorites in the survival horror genre. It plays on the whole jump scare thing back before FNAF was even a thing. To me, Resident Evil is a true classic. First, there was Super Mario Galaxy, a game that is still loved today, but in 2010, Nintendo outdid themselves by doing what is rarely done, and that is improving upon the first one. And they did that with Super Mario Galaxy 2, and here are some stats that prove how great it is. 6,720 copies sold with a 97% metric score, and it took 2.5 years in development. Released in 1991 for various systems, Turrican 2 is as close as Dolph Lundgren will ever get to the greatest game ever, with his awesome Universal Soldier reskin tie-in. Released in 1995 for the PCs, Command & Conquer is by far one of my favorite real-time strategy games ever. And it's the first real-time strategy game I ever played. Yes, it looks like garbage in today's standards, but back in 95, it was a great game. Even though the cutscenes didn't age well, this game itself is pure classic gold. Released in 1991 for the Mega Drive. So, if you had the Mega Drive and wanted to play Final Fight, you were. Released in 2001 for the PS2. Now, I played this game a lot for the reasons I still haven't beaten the game and want to experience it for myself. This game is also a true classic in the survival horror genre. Released in 1994 for the Super Nintendo. Now, for this entry on the list, I'm going to give you the words and opinion of the creator himself, Kevin Bayliss. It's simply so memorable, the game played so well, and it was a perfect way to reintroduce Donkey Kong. Few developers knew the importance of a strong opening right out of the gate, more than Naughty Dog, and they deliver, with the 2009 release of Uncharted 2 for the PS3. Where the prologue for Uncharted 2 when you're climbing a derailed train car dangling from a cliff. Released in 1996 for the PlayStation 2, Final Fantasy X was the first Final Fantasy game to be fully voiced. Shifting to a full 3D environments give a sense of exploration and discovery. It is one of the greatest mini-games of all time, Blitzball. Released in 1994 for the Mega Drive, Sonic & Knuckles was a revolution in the Sonic franchise. It was one of the first games that allowed you to plug in an older Sonic game and play it. And if you play any other game with the Sonic & Knuckles cartridge, you might just unlock a hidden bonus game. Released in 2002 for the GameCube, Metroid Prime was the first Metroid game to be in first-person view, which was something new since the games before that were more of a platformer. Released in 2006 for various systems, Elder Scrolls 3 Oblivion was a change from the previous Elder Scrolls games, where you had a first-person view as you crawl your way through a dungeon. Elder Scrolls 3 changed that by letting you play both in first-person and in third-person, and that carried over to Skyrim. Released in 1996 for the Nintendo 64, Mario Kart 64 was the second game in the series, and it was in party format, which had a vast number of tracks and gave us the power-up of the spiky shell. And the multiplayer was just amazing. I can see why this is one of the greatest games of all time. Red Dead Redemption, released in 2010 for various consoles. Now, one might say this game is essentially GTA on a horse. But if you look past all that, you'll see the characters in the story are just a cut above GTA characters. And it's supposed to have one hell of a great DLC in Undead Nightmare. Secret of Mana, released in 1993 for the Super Nintendo. Secret of Mana was built upon the Game Boy, delivering memorable characters and NPCs and a wonderful story. Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, which was released in 2000 for the N64. Majora's Mask is a true masterpiece, just like my favorite Ocarina of Time, with 3D graphics. In Majora's Mask, you have 3 days to save the world, or watch the moon fall and destroy the town. Mega Man 2, which was released in 1988 for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, Mega Man 2 is one of my personal favorite Nintendo games of all time. The gameplay, the soundtrack will always be one of my favorite NES games. Mega Man 2 did away with the old score system. Instead of 6 bosses, it gave you 8 of them, and it has a nice little password system. If you want to learn more about video game passwords, check out an earlier video on the history of passwords. Sega Rally Championship, released in 1994 for arcades. Sega Rally Championship is one of the best racing games I've played back in the day. Rainbow Islands, released in 1998 for the NES. Rainbow Islands is one of the most interesting game mechanics I've ever seen. Instead of jumping, it introduced a new one. Rainbows. Yes, rainbows. They're both a weapon and a platformer, allowing you to climb to higher areas. Released in 1994 for the PC, UFO Unknown, or XCOM UFO Defense as it was called in the States. Now, XCOM was a great game that blended 2 classic genres into one game. It combined base building with turn-based combat, along with high-stakes gameplay, which included permadeath and permanent consequences. If you make the wrong choices during the building phase of the game, you often had a bad combat phase. Released in 1998 for the N64, Banjo-Kazooie is easily one of the greatest 3D platformers ever. This game reminds me of playing games like Donkey Kong Country, where you can switch between two characters, each with different personalities. You've got Banjo, the easygoing bear, and then you got Kazooie, a bird with a tood. Each level is intricately designed, and one of the main quests I hate in RPG games is the infamous Collectathon quest. These are just boring and tedious, but not in Banjo-Kazooie. This game makes the Collectathon quest fun, with each task collecting certain collectibles each time, which gives you a reward. It feels like you accomplished something. Star Wars, released in 1983 for arcades. Now, I remember playing this age-old arcade game years ago as a kid, and wondering why it's so great. Looking back at it, it was ahead of its time back then. The immersion factor is enhanced with a 3D vector graphics that gives a sense of depth and speed in the game. Now, I have an issue with most movie tie-in games, since they never stick to the source material. But not with Star Wars the arcade game. This is a rare exception, as it gives you the sense of being in Luke Skywalker's shoes as you fly an X-Wing while taking out TIE fighters, and then you soon find yourself reliving the infamous Death Star trench scene as you fly your way to shoot down the air shaft to take out the Death Star once and for all. Now, earlier in the countdown, I talked about Civilization 4, and how it is one of the greatest games, so let's talk about the game that started the series off, Civilization. Civilization is considered one of the greatest games of all time due to many factors, and one of these is the replayability. With each playthrough, the map changes, and you have to learn to adapt to each time, and maybe change your playstyle. The whole idea of building and running an entire civilization, right down to the small stuff like economic growth to culture, makes the game one of the best. Portal, released in 2007 for the PC, deserves to be on the list for many reasons, but for me, it is due to its innovative gameplay, to the compelling story in the game, right down to the physics puzzles in the game. Just don't throw you into it, it helps you along the way with a great learning curve as well. Mass Effect 2, released in 2010 for various consoles. Now, I can attest that Mass Effect 2 is one of my favorite of the games. It reminds me of the old Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, as there are points in the game where you have to make a choice, and what you choose affects the rest of the game and how you play. Paradroid, released in 1985 for various systems. Paradroid is considered one of the greatest games of its time, and also for the 8-bit game era as well. The immersion is courtesy of the open-ended gameplay, which allows you to explore where you want to while you take over the droid by using a circuit-based minigame. At number 58 is another Pokemon game, Pokemon Red and Blue, which was released in 1996 for the Game Boy. This is one of the games that revolutionized the RPG genre and started one of the most recognizable and loved franchises ever, Pokemon. And here are a few reasons why. First off, the whole gotta catch 'em all concept is genius. It forced the player to explore every inch of the game itself to find every Pokemon they can find. Next is the train and battle system. This also makes the player to train their Pokemon to be faster and better, which gives them the sense of progression and achievement in the game. And finally, the turn-based combat, where you had to play strategically, figuring out what types and moveset would give you the best chance of winning a battle. BioShock, released in 2007, is a game that I will always love. I remember playing this game and staying up late and trying to beat this game in one shot. But here are some reasons why this game is on the list. Number 1, the innovative storytelling. Most games have a story told via cutscenes, but not BioShock. The story is completely woven into the game itself. Where you have to get the full story of the underwater city of Rapture, you have to find all the audio logs and talk to the NPCs. Next is the setting, which is truly brilliant. Being in a rundown underwater city of Rapture, to me this is an awesome aspect of the game, and what is going on in the background actually affects the game itself. You have to go straight, you're blocked by water coming in from some crash in the glass. Next up is the theme and philosophy of the game, which also makes the game a fun playthrough. In BioShock, Andrew Ryan's vision of an underwater city with no government and or religion interference seems like utopia, right? But is actually pure chaos. Let's not forget the memorable characters in the game. Before I mentioned Andrew Ryan, the wonderful creator of Rapture, to Sander Cohen, the deranged artist, and let's not forget the two characters that cause you to make a decision that affects the end of the game itself, Big Brothers and Little Sisters. Now in Bioshock, you can learn different abilities with plasmids. However, the only way to actually get them is to pay for them with atoms, which can only be obtained by harvesting Little Sisters, which you find after you take out a Big Brother. However, if you want the good ending, you have to set every Little Sister free in the game, versus the bad ending where you harvest them all for the atom. Bioshock to me is so good that the other two sequels are just as good. In Bioshock 2, you play as a Big Brother, and in Bioshock Infinite, it takes the whole story of Utopian City to a whole new level with Columbia. I could go into how all three games connect, but that's for an entirely different video altogether. Dungeon Master, released in 1987 for the Atari ST. Dungeon Master is one of the best dungeon crawlers around, and here are some reasons why. The real-time combat and exploration made it engaging to play, as you had to think quick on dealing with enemies and to solve puzzles. Dungeon Master uses a grid-based inventory system, which made it easier to manage items and spells. And let's mention the spellcasting system. In most RPG games, spells were just one type. Fire spells cast fire, base attacks, but not in Dungeon Master. Here you have the combat runes that create spells, which allowed the player to create unique and innovative spells. Jet Set Willy, released in 1984 for various systems, is a game that I have never played, but what makes it one of the 100 greatest games of all time? Well, here's a list. The game is extremely challenging, where you have to try and avoid obstacles, which adds a layer of challenge that keeps the player invested in the gameplay. Another part is the open-ended exploration. This allows the player to explore interconnected worlds, which was ahead of its time. The mechanic allows the player to explore all over each world, which was not heard of in any other platformer at the time. And finally, Jet Set Willy is a technical achievement for its time, since it was made for the ZX Spectrum. Jet Set Willy pushed the system to its absolute limits with detailed level design and smooth scrolling gameplay. Counter-Strike, released in 2000 for the PCs. Now, Counter-Strike was one of the first FPS games with multiplayer, and here are some other reasons that make this game great. Counter-Strike is not your typical FPS game. Instead of just going out blazing, here you have to manage your team by communicating to them what you want them to do. And lastly, this game has absolutely no overpowered weapons. Though in most first-person shooter games, there is always a weapon that is way too overpowered that makes the game totally one-sided and unfair. Not in Counter-Strike. Here you have weapons that are not overpowered and are equally competitive. Shadow of the Colossus was released in 2005 for the PlayStation 2. Now, Shadow of the Colossus is a game that transcends traditional gameplay. It's more than a quest to defeat monsters, it's exploration of isolation, awe, and the consequences of your actions. Shadow of the Colossus begins with a simple, almost minimalist concept. A lone hero, a desolate world, and 16 giant beings known as the Colossi. The world feels almost empty with no towns, NPCs, or distractions. It's a world where the only goal is to hunt down and defeat these colossal creatures. The Colossi themselves are a marvel of design and scale. They aren't just a simple boss battles. They are encounters with nature itself, immersive, awe-inspiring, and absolutely terrifying. I love this game. It's an experiment of isolation and overcoming the impossible. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, which was released in 2003 for the absolute original Xbox. This is by far one of my favorite Star Wars games of all time. The concept reminds me of Mass Effect 2, or as Mass Effect 2 reminds me of Knights of the Old Republic. Anyway, in this game you play as a Jedi who travels the universe, and you have to make choices that eventually dictate what side you'll end up on. Make choices that the light will not approve and you'll end up on the dark side, and vice versa. I would love to play this game again, and also play its sequel as well, Knights of the Old Republic 2. Sensible Soccer, released in 1992 for various systems. First off, the gameplay, it's incredibly simple. You don't need complicated sets of controls to get into the action. One button is for passing, and one button is for shooting. That's all you need. But the beauty is in the execution. This simply allows players to focus on the strategy and flow of the game, not in memorizing with tricky combos. Yet, the skill gap is clear. Mastering long passes, controlling the ball, and timing your shots requires practice. But anyone can jump in and have a good time right from the start. The pace of sensible soccer is another key factor. The game is fast, it's frantic, and it feels like you're always in the thick of it. Unlike some sports games that can feel slow and methodical, sensible soccer allows quick passes, rapid runs, and scoring within a second of getting the ball. This sense of speed makes the game feel alive. Each match is dynamic, each pass is a potential goal, and no lead is safe. Whether you're playing for 10 minutes or 2 hours, the game's pace never gets stale. Not to mention the top-down isometric camera views in sensible soccer were revolutionary at the time. The unique perspective allows you to see the entire pitch, giving you a sense of control and strategy that's often missing in more modern games with closer behind-the-player cameras. Doom 2 released in 1994 for the PCs. Now, I have to say this game is truly awesome and a great change to the Doom franchise earlier in its life cycle of the series altogether. Doom was in itself an influential, but a sequel was to me one of the best games around for the PC, so why is that? Well, first let's talk about weapons. Doom 2 is home to some of the most iconic firearms in the history, but no more so than its super shotgun. Oh yeah, you know the one. It's a double-barreled beast that turns demons into bloody chunks with a single pull of the trigger. Of course, no great shooter would be complete without a share of terrifying enemies, and Doom 2 introduces a variety of new monsters. First up is the Kaka Demon, a floating ball of flesh with one giant gaping mouth. And then there's the Acrotron, a spider-like machine that shoots deadly energy blasts. But the true star of Doom 2, you ask? Well, that's the Cyber Demon, of course. This towering rocket-launching monstrosity was a force to be reckoned with, testing players' skill and patience. Defeating it felt like a true accomplishment. What truly sets Doom 2 apart, though, is its level design, from the chaotic streets of the city to the twisted labyrinthine paths of the inmost den. Each level is crafted with care and attention to detail. The opening design of the levels allows for a sense of exploration, while also providing opportunities for players to be ambushed by swarms of demons. The levels are more than just arenas to fight in. They're full of secrets, hidden passages, and traps that keep the players on their toes. Every corner hides something new, rewarding curiosity with more ammo, health, or even enemies to fight. And then there's the multiplayer. Doom 2 wasn't just about playing solo, it laid the foundation for competitive gaming with its deathmatch mode. For the first time ever, players could join together, battling it out in arenas filled with weapons, power-ups, and plenty of chaos. Well, that wraps up the first 50 games in our countdown of 100 greatest video games of all time. There were some absolute classics in there, and we're only just scratching the surface. What do you think? Did your favorite make the list? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, and if you're new around here, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next 50 games. And with that, I'm Professor Retro reminding you to keep your controllers powered up and your consoles turned on, and don't blow on your NES cartridge. And game on. Peace out and stay frosty.